share with you that our brother Tom Meyer is in the hospital. We don't know, he's had some sort of an intestinal blockage, and I talked to Pam last night. He was, they were taking him in very early this morning for x-rays to see if they could further determine what was going on, and he very well could be in surgery right now. We're not sure, but we're going to be praying for Tom this morning in our liturgy, so just keep him in your thoughts and in your prayers as we go through the week as he recovers from this. So just so that I wanted you to all know that. And then I would also like to do something that's going to get me in trouble. But I want to introduce my friend Ingrid. Ingrid's here this morning with baby Annie. And we're getting ready for a baptism in the next few weeks coming up. And so they're here with us this morning. And we're looking forward to that really wonderful event. Amen. And then I see that Susan just saw Ingrid. So anyway, welcome Ingrid and Annie. So you've probably shared this experience with me. You're sitting in front of the TV and there's nothing on. You know, it's one of those, you just sign out, there's just nothing on. So you begin the inevitable process of surfing. And as you do, you're going along, and again, you're still not finding much, and all of a sudden you happen upon what is obviously a comedy show. Now, it's from another culture. So it could be Asian, or it could be Hispanic. It could be from our funny talking friends across the pond. But as you sit there and you watch it for a few minutes, and the laugh track is going, and you're watching it, and you're going, I don't get it. I don't see why that's funny. You know, it's just not grabbing you. And, you know, it's a very common experience because humor requires that you be on the inside of the joke, right? We've all heard that. Well, it's an inside joke. And so for us, when we hear humor, it's funny because it touches something that we are connected with. And oftentimes when we see, you know, comedy from another culture, it's completely out of our context, and so we don't make the proper connections for the humor to come through. Well, oftentimes, when we read the Gospels, we have a very similar event happen. We read it, and sometimes it's not always clear what's going on because we're not on the inside of what's happening. And so this morning, what I wanted to do, we have this reading this morning, this passage. And it's not an uncommon event in the Gospels where Jesus faces off with the Pharisees. They have some sort of a criticism or complaint. He responds to them in some cryptic fashion, and then he later has to go and explain it to his disciples because they don't get it either. And so this morning we have one of these classic, what we call conflict stories, where Jesus and the Pharisees are kind of in this face-off. And in the one we're listening to this morning, kind of the pat answer is, well, we get it. The Pharisees are legalists. They believe in salvation by works. And of course, Jesus came proclaiming a gospel of grace. And so there's your answer. It's simple. Well, not quite so simple. While there is a kernel of truth in that, there's a much larger story to be understood. In order to do that, we have to go back about 600 years. In 597 BC, the hordes of Nebuchadnezzar sweep into Jerusalem. They conquer the city, they take it, and they begin deporting the people from Jerusalem and from the outlying areas in Judea into captivity into Babylon. This goes on for 10 years. During this time, one of the deportees, who is among one of the early groups to be taken to Babylon, is a priest. He's a priest serving at the altar in Jerusalem. And he's also a prophet. His name is Ezekiel. And some of you have read parts of the book of Ezekiel, and you know it's full of tremendous imagery, apocalyptic imagery, and it's the one that talks about God's seeing it, the throne of God and a wheel within a wheel, and it's all this really amazing apocalyptic imagery. When Ezekiel was in captivity in Babylon, he has a vision. And the vision that Ezekiel has is of the glory of God in the temple. And the glory of God in this vision departs from the temple and leaves Jerusalem. That's his vision. Now, within a year or 2 or 3, Nebuchadnezzar raises the temple. It's destroyed. And it's no longer. The rest of the people have been carried into captivity in Babylon, where they remained for decades, until, along, just in standard political changes, we see Cyrus, the king of Persia. Persia conquers Babylon. Cyrus comes in, and he takes pity on the Jews, and he allows the people of Judah to return to Jerusalem. When they arrive, they begin rebuilding their temple. It's about 538, and it takes about close to 20 years, and in the year 516, the temple is completed, and now the people have the temple back to offer sacrifices and to worship. And yet something notable doesn't happen. God's glory does not return to the temple. They have the temple, but God has not filled it with his Shekinah glory. Now in Ezekiel the prophet and many of the other Old Testament prophets, Isaiah, for example, the last third of the book of Isaiah, is filled with promises that God one day is going to return to Zion, and God is going to fill Jerusalem with his presence. Those promises are abundant in the prophets. During this 500-year period, Jerusalem is under constant subjugation to foreign powers. Though they've been allowed to return to Jerusalem, they are essentially still in exile because God's presence hasn't returned, and they're subjugated by foreign powers. Whether it's initially the Persians, they're a vassal to the Persians, and then later it's the Greeks. Finally, Alexander the Great comes in and conquers. Then there's a period to the Egyptians having control over Jerusalem. Then it's the Syrians, and finally it's the Romans in 63 BC. And so during this long period, we have Judah and the kingdom of Judah and Jerusalem essentially under foreign subjugation, and God has not returned. And so there's this great longing by the people. They want God to come and renew his presence with them and to restore their national hopes and identity. One little glimmer that happens during this period, and one little glimmer of hope. In the year 175, a truly maniacal ruler, easy for me to say, named Antiochus IV. He's Syrian. He comes to power. And he recognizes the only way he's really going to truly have control over these people in Jerusalem and Judah, these strange people of the land of Israel, the only way he can really gain control over them is to really destroy their national identity, to take away those symbols which are so important that hold them together. And what are some of those symbols? Well, one is the temple. Their kosher laws, their food laws are so important. It gives them their national identity, and they're in maintaining their kosher food laws, they're being obedient to God. So Antiochus realizes this. He forbids them to gather on the Sabbath for worship and to obey God's law about the Sabbath. He recognizes that in order to destroy their identity, he has to destroy their religious identity. Ultimately, he goes into the very temple, and he sacrifices a pig on the altar and spreads the pig's blood on the altar as a way to essentially tell the people, this is no longer your temple. That's what Antiochus does. Well, there are a group of very zealous, faithful Jews who are assiduously faithful to all of the rules and all of the laws that God has given, as we heard this morning in the book of Deuteronomy. And a hero among them named Judas Maccabees leads the people in a revolt, in a military revolt, and they eventually defeat the Syrians militarily, and Antiochus is killed, and they're forced to leave. The Jews then cleanse the temple, and we all know at that event that we still see every year the celebration of that event. It's called Hanukkah. The very feast of Hanukkah that the Jews still celebrate commemorates the defeat of the Syrians and the restoration and cleansing of the temple. It's really interesting when we look at the food laws in Israel. Well, let me say one thing before I even go there. During this time, there's a group that rises up in Israel. And I guess we would call them a political, religious group. And now, I think we all understand that there's no distinction in Israel between politics and religion in ancient Israel. God is king, they're his servants, and so everything political is religious and everything religious is ultimately political. You know, we look at it through a different lens, but everything in ancient Israel, there's no distinction between politics and religion. A group rises up, and they have just witnessed this series of events that's actually recorded for us in the book of Maccabees. There's actually 1st and 2nd Maccabees, which is in it's one of the apocryphal books that we have in the Catholic Bible. The Protestants don't have 1st and 2nd Maccabees. And in the book of Maccabees, we actually have a series of very ghastly torture and murder and execution by Antiochus of those faithful Jews who would not accede to him and who would not eat pork. They simply said, no, we are not going to eat pork. If you're going to kill me, then kill me, but I'm not going to disobey the law of God. And so through their obedience, God blesses them in the view of the people. God blesses Israel. Judas Maccabees arises, and they defeat the Syrians. And so we see this pressure group that grows up about this time. We're not sure how direct the connection is, but this group rises up, and they have very strict adherence to the laws, and they also have very strong militaristic bent. They believe that God will operate or function his will through military force. Does anybody happen to know who that group might be? People in the 8 o'clock hours. Anybody have a clue who I'm talking about? The Pharisees. Pharisees. The Pharisees were a group that arose around 150, and they had a kind of a double agenda. One was to maintain absolute purity and faithfulness to the law within Israel, and they believed that through that purity it would hasten God's return, and that ultimately, if need be, they would then enter into military force and try to unseat, at this point we're talking about the Romans. And so the Pharisees, a large number of the Pharisees are very militaristic. Now, what is it about these food laws we're talking about? Today we hear in the gospel references to these traditions of the elders. Are we talking about the law of Moses that we just heard spoken of from Deuteronomy, where Moses says, you're to obey all of the laws that God has given you, and you're not to add to any of them, you're not to subtract from any of them, you're to obey the laws that are laid out in the Torah. So what are these laws of the elders, or these traditions of the elders that we hear in the gospel this morning? Well, many of you know, some of you don't, but many of you know that in my day job, I'm a biologist, and I work specifically with endangered species, and I work with wetlands, and I've been doing this for 20 years. And I do a lot of work with endangered species. Well, if you've ever seen the Endangered Species Act, it was written in 1973. It's about that thick. It's literally about 15 or 20 pages. The entire law is about 15 or 20 pages. Since 1973, when the Endangered Species Act was passed, there has grown up regulations about the Endangered Species Act, or implementing the Endangered Species Act, that has to be in the order of tens of thousands of pages. So the regulations that have grown up around this particular law literally would, be this high. So what we have in ancient Israel is not a situation that's completely different from that. We have the law of Moses. If you go to the 11th chapter of the book of Leviticus, we see the food laws. It's all in one chapter. All the food laws, all the kosher laws are all set forth in a single chapter in the book of Leviticus. It's chapter 11. And in that it says things like, it addresses the animals oftentimes by their hoofs. But, you can eat a lamb, can't eat a pig. You can eat fish with fins and scales, but you can't eat you can't eat shellfish. There are certain kinds of insects you can eat. There are certain kinds of insects you can't eat. Now, if you happen to come into contact with one of those animals that's on this side of the ledger, or that's one of the unclean animals, then you're unclean. It's not a moral law. It's not saying that you've done something immoral. It just says you're ritually unclean. Well, what does that mean? Well, it just means you're ritually unclean, and the remedy for that is simple. You wash, and by the end of the day, you are no longer ritually unclean. Real simple. There were other laws within. There's other specific rules set forth in Leviticus 11. If you have say you have your pots and pans that you cook in, and one of the unclean animals accidentally touches those, you have to destroy it. Well, this kind of gets to be a little bit inconvenient, we've all had this happen, right? You're having people over for dinner. You haven't had out the nice china lately. You open it up and take out a cup. And there's a dead bug in it, right? We've all had that happen. Well, if you're in ancient Israel, it's the wrong dead bug. Now all of a sudden you got to destroy grandma's china. So it becomes to be a bit of a nuisance. What happened over a period of a few hundred years is that the rabbis and the elders in Israel began to develop ways around the very simple laws that were set forth in Leviticus and Exodus, and it wasn't just about food laws. They began to see ways, loopholes. Okay, we're all familiar with that term as we are in the political environment now, and everybody's talking about closing all the tax loopholes, right? Well, the Jewish laws, the rabbis and the elders, they were finding loopholes in the laws so that people wouldn't have to destroy grandma's china if they found the wrong bug in it. If you went out into the field, this will sound familiar, and you were picking grain, and you accidentally touched an insect that was the wrong kind of insect, not only could you not have that head of grain, but you were unclean. And so there was all these sets of rules. Now Jesus points one out. It's not one of the food rules, but in today's gospel, Jesus points one out. He says, simple, honor your father and mother. What could be more basic than that? Honor your father and mother. And he says, and he quotes the law. And he says, but here's what you've done. You say, well, I want to honor my mother and father and give them some financial assistance, but Korban was the law where it says, this is again a tradition, this isn't in the Torah, it's a tradition that grew up, that said, if you dedicate everything that you have to God, then you don't have to give it to anybody else. And so, how convenient. Okay, I'm going to take everything I own, I'm going to say Korban. Now, I can certainly live off what I need, and I certainly have to tithe to, I have to give my tithes to the temple. But I don't have to give anything to mom and dad now because it's been dedicated to God. And so Jesus, what is Jesus saying? He's saying, you got to be kidding me. It says, honor your father and mother, and now you've developed this tradition of your own so that you have now this loophole that you can get around and not have to take care of your parents. And so that's Jesus' criticism. So what we're faced with today, as we look at the gospel, we're not dealing here with just a simple kind of dichotomy of you know, the Pharisees are legalists and Jesus is coming preaching the gospel of grace. So again, there's certainly truth in that. But what we're really looking at, we're looking at two very different agendas. The Pharisees are encouraging the people around them to these incredible demands of righteousness through keeping all of these rules and regulations which they've developed over the years. And their hope is that this somehow is going to usher in God's approval, God's kingdom, and that it will allow them to go off in a military to a military encounter with the Romans and beat them. On the other hand, you have Jesus and his agenda. What is the agenda of Jesus anyway? Jesus comes, and Jesus is come to the people, and we hear this in what we call the Nazareth Manifesto. We hear many times in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 4, where Jesus goes into the synagogue in Nazareth, and they give him the scroll of the prophet, and it's Isaiah, and he reads, and he says, you know, that the slaves will be set free, and all of these things are going to happen. And Jesus says, and this has been fulfilled in your hearing. The people of Israel were praying. They were longing for the return of God to Israel. It was happening right in front of them in Jesus. In Jesus, God had returned to Zion. God was fulfilling all of his promises that he had made through the prophets. It just didn't look like what they thought it was going to look like. They thought it was going to look like Judas Maccabees. They were going to kick out the evil Romans at this point. It didn't look anything like that. Jesus comes. He is now the fulfillment of every law. What does Jesus say? I didn't come to destroy the law. I didn't come to nullify the law. I came to fulfill it. Jesus ultimately fulfills every aspect of the law. But Jesus also comes offering forgiveness. Right? Jesus says, your sins are forgiven. And what did his opponents say? Well, who can forgive sins but God? Right? Jesus comes and he forgives sins. Well, what does that make irrelevant? The temple. The temple's no longer relevant. Jesus is the living temple among them. Jesus is the one who brings forgiveness. All of those things were a shadow. Those things were to direct the people. They were to point the people to what God was really doing. And at the time of Jesus, Jesus was the embodiment of everything that Yahweh had promised. I heard it put this way by one of my favorite Bible scholars, N.T. Wright. Now, he's English. So he says, you don't put up a sign pointing to London when you're in the middle of Piccadilly Circus. And it was or we could make that we could put that in terms of something we would understand. You don't put a sign pointing to New York in the middle of Times Square on New Year's Eve. So it's pretty clear. When Jesus is here, everything in the Old Testament is pointing to him. He is the fulfillment of all the laws that God has set. Some of them have now become a shadow. They're still pointing towards him, but they're not the reality. He is the reality. And so today, as we think about these words of the gospel, what we need to understand is that Jesus is the reality. Jesus has come to show us how to be the image of God, which is what we were originally intended to be. We are created to image God, to the world around us, and to also to be within this world, imaging God's creation back to him. And so Jesus came as the fulfillment of everything God had done up to that point. James summarizes it very well today. He says that we are the foreshadowing. We are the first fruits of this new people who are now living out what God had always intended. And it was through Jesus. Jesus warned about armed revolution. He was telling the Pharisees, you're going down the wrong path. He was warning everyone that he could to say, if you stay on this road, bad things are going to happen. And he even says, if you stay on this road, there will be one stone left upon another in Jerusalem. That is what he told the people. That's what he told his followers. Jesus came with a different agenda. His agenda was peace and to ultimately go to the cross. To ultimately go to the cross, not to bring an armed revolution against the Romans. He would be the one who would ultimately go to the cross, take on all the pain and suffering of all of Israel and all of the world, and through that, he would be, again, everything that God had been pointing to in the Old Testament would be fulfilled in Jesus. And so again, when we read these stories, like we read today in the Gospel, from week to week, I would just ask that you try to look at this from the bigger perspective. We get wrapped up in the little details, and I hope that what I've shared with you today helped you to get more in touch with the saving gospel of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.